Hi everyone. Welcome back to our channel where stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you're someone who believes in empathy, hope, and second chances, you're in the right place. They thought it was just another pile of trash on a frozen New York street. But when a billionaire stopped to look closer, what he found inside those cardboard boxes didn't just change his night, it changed his life forever. And what that little girl whispered next made him drop to his knees. Before we dive into the full story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories of resilience, unexpected miracles, and lives that find hope when it seems all but gone. Every click counts and every story matters. Now, let's begin. The wind howled through Times Square, like a living thing tearing through the neon chaos and rattling the metal gates of shuttered shops. It was January, the kind of night where even the cabs seemed to hurry past engines grumbling against the bite of winter. Lucas Bennett, the man whose name lit up financial magazines and technology headlines, walked alone with his collar pulled high and his gloved hands shoved deep into the pockets of his gray overcoat. For once, he hadn't called his driver. He'd left the chauffeured car idling by the curb and dismissed it with a wave. The thought of being driven back to his silent Manhattan penthouse where every echo reminded him of what he didn't have was unbearable tonight. He didn't know what he was looking for out there among the lights and shadows, maybe just noise to drown out the kind of silence that feels heavier than any storm. His leather shoes splashed through slush as he passed clusters of bundled-up tourists snapping selfies beneath the glowing billboards, all laughter and chatter, oblivious to the kind of loneliness that money can't touch. Lucas, 32. A billionaire before he could legally rent a car, felt like a ghost drifting through the city that never sleeps. That was when he saw it. At first, it was nothing. Just a crumpled heap of cardboard stacked near the closed entrance of a souvenir shop beneath a flickering neon sign that read, almost mockingly, "Open 24 hours." He would have walked past New York streets were littered with sights like that until a flash of pink caught his eye. A shoe, tiny. Frayed along the edges, the laces knotted into desperate loops. It wasn't moving, but something about it tugged at him. Maybe it was the way the snow had gathered unevenly around it, like someone had been trying to burrow in for warmth. Lucas stopped scanning the street. No one was looking. A man in a Yankees cap shuffled by with his head down, earbuds drowning out the world. A taxi honked somewhere distant, but otherwise the block was quiet. Against his better judgment, Lucas stepped closer, his breath fogging in the icy air. "Hello," he said, voice tentative as if speaking too loudly might break the night. "Is someone there?" For a moment, there was nothing but the moan of the wind winding between buildings. He told himself it was nothing, just refuse, and took a step back. Then the pile trembled. A subtle shivering movement, almost imperceptible, but it froze him in place. From a gap in the flattened boxes, two eyes appeared, wide brown and impossibly scared. Lucas crouched instinctively, ignoring the cold that instantly seeped through his slacks. "Hey," he said softly, as if speaking to a wild animal that might bolt at the wrong word. "Are you okay?" The eyes blinked, hesitant. Slowly, a small face emerged from the shadows, a girl no older than 4, her dark hair matted and tangled around her pale cheeks. Dirt smudged her delicate features, but her expression wasn't one of self-pity. It was watchful, almost defiant, like a stray kitten who had learned not to trust outstretched hands. She clutched something to her chest, a threadbare stuffed rabbit, whose one-button eye dangled by a thread. Lucas felt something twist inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. Not pity, not shock, something heavier. The CEO, who'd stared down boardrooms full of sharks who'd closed deals worth more than the GDP of small countries, was suddenly at a loss for words in front of a child who looked like she'd been left behind by the whole world. "You shouldn't be out here," he murmured, careful not to startle her. "Where are your parents? Are you lost?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she shifted slightly, pulling her coat tighter. It was far too big for her, clearly scavenged the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady, carrying a weight far too old for someone so small. "It's not a bed," she whispered, eyes fixed on his, "but it keeps the cold away." The words hit Lucas harder than the wind ever could. No tremor of complaint, no plea. Just a fact stated with the kind of raw honesty only a child could manage. He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice from betraying the sting in his chest. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Mia," she said, after a long pause, clutching the rabbit tighter. "Mia Carter." Lucas felt a flicker of recognition, though he couldn't place it until she moved slightly and he saw what she was holding beneath the rabbit, a photograph, edges creased and worn sealed in a cloudy plastic sleeve. She hesitated but extended it toward him as if weighing whether or not to trust him. Lucas reached out slowly and took it. When he turned the photo over and saw the face smiling back at him, the world tilted. The cold vanished, replaced by a roaring in his ears. His knees gave way, and before he could stop himself, he was on the wet, frozen sidewalk, staring at a ghost from his past. Sophie, his sister. The sister he hadn't seen in 5 years. The sister who'd vanished after their final vicious argument, leaving no trace but unanswered questions and a hole in his chest he never admitted was there. Lucas's breath came ragged, fogging in front of his face. Where did you get this?" he managed, voice almost a whisper. "She's my mama," Mia said simply, as if that explained everything. Time seemed to fracture. Sophie had a daughter who was now huddled under cardboard on a freezing New York street, clutching a stuffed rabbit, and a photo like they were her only shields against the world. Lucas stared at Mia, his mind racing and blank all at once. He drew a slow, shaky breath, forcing himself to focus. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Lots of nights," Mia murmured. "Mama got sick. She told me to wait. She didn't come back." Lucas looked up at the garish neon lights of Times Square, the billboards screaming promises of things nobody really needed, and felt the weight of his reality crash into him. This little girl, his niece, though she didn't know. It was alone, and Sophie was somewhere out there, or worse. The thought made his chest ache. He slid off his overcoat and wrapped it gently around Mia's shoulders. The coat dwarfed her, but she didn't flinch this time. She looked up at him, eyes wide, searching. "Are you gonna help me?" she asked. Lucas knotted his throat tight. "Yes. You're coming with me. You're safe now. I'll find your Mama Mia, I promise." And for the first time in years, as he scooped up the weightless child and felt her tiny arms cling to his neck, Lucas Bennett realized that his life, carefully built, meticulously controlled, and utterly hollow, was about to change forever. He thought taking her home would be the hardest part. But what happens when a billionaire who's never held a bedtime storybook has to become the only person a frightened little girl can trust? The lessons Lucas Bennett was about to learn would change both their lives forever. The first morning after Mia Carter entered Lucas Bennett's penthouse, he realized he had stepped into a life he was entirely unprepared for. His home, perched high above Central Park, with its sweeping glass walls and muted modern decor, was designed for cocktail parties and quiet solitary nights, not for a 4-year-old who clutched a stuffed rabbit like it was her lifeline. Everything in the apartment gleamed cold, immaculate, and lifeless. It wasn't a home. It was a museum where he happened to sleep. Watching Mia stand barefoot on the marble floor, her wide eyes darting from the towering windows to the unfamiliar furniture, Lucas felt a sharp pang of something he hadn't felt in years, the urge to make someone feel safe. He started with the only thing he knew: action. By noon, designers and delivery crews were streaming in and out, turning a sterile guest bedroom into a child's refuge. The gray walls became a soft lavender strung with delicate fairy lights that glowed like fireflies when the sun dipped below the skyline. Low shelves lined one wall stocked with picture books, puzzles, and a few plush toys carefully chosen after he'd awkwardly asked a store clerk, "What do 4-year-olds actually like?" A small bed with safety rails stood against the opposite wall, its blanket patterned with clouds. When it was finished, Lucas stood back and surveyed the room. It felt warmer already, but Mia only lingered at the threshold, clutching her rabbit. She didn't step inside until he knelt and said quietly, "It's yours. All of it. You don't have to sleep on the floor anymore." But giving her a room didn't stop the nightmares. The first few nights, Lucas woke to hear her crying soft, stifled sobs that cut through the quiet like sirens. At first, he hesitated standing outside her door, unsure how to approach without scaring her more. On the third night, when the cries stretched long and trembled like broken glass, he finally went in. Sitting on the edge of her tiny bed, he reached out a hand, resting it gently on her tangled hair. "It's okay, Mia," he whispered, surprising himself with how unsteady his own voice sounded. "You're safe here, I promise." She didn't answer, but her breathing slowed. Her small body relaxed by degrees, and eventually the sobs faded into deep, steady sleep. Lucas stayed there in the dim glow of the fairy lights until he was sure she wouldn't wake again. By the end of the week, something resembling a rhythm began to take shape. It wasn't easy. Lucas had to learn things he had never bothered with before: how to make breakfast that didn't come in a takeout container, how to braid Mia's hair badly at first, how to read bedtime stories without sounding like he was giving a presentation to shareholders. They began building little rituals that stitched their strange new life together. Each Sunday, Mia stood on a stool in the gleaming kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, determined to help make pancakes. She would insist on pouring the batter into lopsided heart shapes, more on the counter than in the pan, laughing when the spatula sent bits of pancake flying. Lucas, who had once scheduled his weekends around investors' calls and international flights, now found himself laughing too, batter splattered across his shirt. She was shy in public, so Lucas started taking her to quieter places, letting her find pieces of the world she could explore safely. Her favorite was the American Museum of Natural History, where she would press her small hands to the glass, staring up at towering dinosaur skeletons with wide-eyed wonder. One evening, after hours, Lucas arranged a private tour through a quiet wing, just the two of them and the echoes of the past. Mia clung to his hand, not out of fear, but awe, whispering, "Do you think they were lonely when everyone else was gone?" Lucas, whose life had been filled with boardrooms and bright city lights, but little connection, found himself strangely unable to answer. On quieter nights at home, they discovered another shared ritual. Lucas had bought Mia a small keyboard, thinking music might soothe her. She didn't know how to play, but she pressed the keys with the cautious excitement of someone testing a locked door. Together they made up silly songs, Lucas plunking out awkward bass notes while Mia sang about the rabbit she named Mr. Button and how pancakes were better than pizza. In those moments, with her laughter echoing through the once hollow apartment, Lucas realized he was learning something he'd forgotten long ago: how to be present. For all the light Mia was bringing into his life, shadows still lingered. When Lucas tucked her in each night, he noticed the way she kept the photo of her mother under her pillow fingertips, brushing the worn edges, as if contact alone could conjure Sophie back. She rarely spoke about her mother, but when she did, her words were simple and heavy. "She always looked behind us when we walked," she said one evening, staring at the glow of the fairy lights. She said we had to be careful. She said some people were bad. Lucas listened, his jaw tightening as he filed away every detail, every scrap of a clue. Whatever Sophie had been running from it hadn't stopped, and he wasn't going to let it catch Mia. By the second week, Lucas knew he couldn't wait any longer. While Mia colored pictures of dinosaurs at the kitchen table, he stepped into his office and called Vanessa, his assistant. "Find the best private investigator in the city," he said. "Money is no object. I need answers about my sister, where she's been, what happened to her, and why her daughter was left to freeze on the street." Vanessa, who had seen Lucas close deals worth billions without a flicker of emotion, heard something new in his voice, urgency, almost desperation, and simply replied, "I'll handle it." The investigators' first reports painted a fractured, haunting picture. Sophie Carter had lived in at least 6 cities over the past 3 years, using both her real name and aliases, moving from cheap apartments to rented rooms. She had taken odd jobs, never staying in one place for long. It was clear she wasn't drifting aimlessly, she was running. From what or whom, no one could yet say. But then came the lead that made Lucas's grip tighten on the phone. A woman matching Sophie's description had been admitted to Boston General Hospital 3 weeks earlier. A hit-and-run victim. Critical injuries. No ID. Unconscious for days. Lucas ended the call and looked toward the kitchen where Mia sat, swinging her legs, humming a tune to herself as she drew. The paper in front of her showed 3 figures, a little girl, a tall man, and a woman with long hair, all holding hands beneath a sky scribbled with stars. He felt something shift inside him, a steady resolve hardening in his chest. For Mia's sake and Sophie's, he would not just stand by and hope. He would find his sister no matter the cost. That night, as he tucked Mia into bed, she whispered drowsily, "Uncle Lou, do you think Mama will find us?" Lucas smoothed her hair, his own voice quiet but certain. "No, Mia, we're going to find her." And as she drifted off to sleep, still clutching the photograph, Lucas stared at the city lights beyond the window and silently vowed whatever ghosts haunted Sophie, he would face them head-on. Because for the first time in his life, someone needed him, not as a billionaire, not as a name in magazines, but simply as family, and he would not fail them. Lucas thought finding Mia was the beginning of the fight, but far from Manhattan, in a quiet hospital room in Boston, a woman with no memory clutches fragments of a life she can't name. And every night Sophie Carter dreams of a little girl, calling Mommy, a voice, pulling her back from the shadows before time runs out. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something heavier like time itself had settled into the beige walls. Sophie Carter didn't know how long she had been there, only that every day felt like it began in the same fog and ended in the same darkness. The nurses called her Anne because she had no name to give them. She had no documents, no memory, not even the faintest thread to tie herself to the person she had once been. 3 weeks had passed since she was struck by a car on a dimly lit Boston street, left broken on the pavement while the driver fled. They told her she'd been unconscious for 4 days. When she woke, everything her name, her past, the reasons she was even in Boston, was a blank slate. But her nights weren't blank. In the hours between midnight and dawn, when the world outside her window grew silent, and the shadows stretched long across the tile floor, the dreams came. They were always the same, relentless and cruelly vivid. Headlights cutting through the dark, screeching tires, the sharp taste of fear in her mouth as she tried to run, and a voice piercing through the chaos, high-trembling, desperate. Mommy. She always woke, gasping, clutching the thin hospital blanket, her chest tight, as though the cry had torn a hole through her heart. The doctors told her it was her mind processing the trauma of the accident, but Sophie, though she didn't yet know that was her name, felt the truth in her bones. The child's voice wasn't her imagination. It was a memory. By day, she tried to hold on to the fragments the dreams left behind. A face she could never fully see, a pair of small hands gripping hers, a word she whispered over and over under her breath, without understanding it. Sunflower. She wrote the pieces down in a blue notebook the nurses had given her, pages filled with half-formed drawings and single words. Run, Photo Park, Jack. The last name especially haunted her. Every time she wrote it, her hand trembled as if some buried part of her understood its weight. One afternoon, while sunlight filtered weakly through the thin curtains, she sat cross-legged on the bed sketching. Her fingers moved almost of their own accord, and when she looked down, a child's face stared back at her from the paper. Round cheeks, wide brown eyes, a smile tinged with sadness. The sight made her throat close. She traced the lines, whispering to herself, "Who are you, and why does it hurt so much to not remember?" She didn't notice Nurse Kim watching from the doorway, her expression soft. "That's the same face you've been drawing for days," Kim said gently. "Maybe she's someone important to you." Sophie nodded, unable to explain that important didn't even begin to cover the way her chest ached whenever she thought of that little girl. While Sophie battled her own mind, Lucas Bennett was in motion hundreds of miles away. The lead from his investigator had pointed him toward Boston, to shelters and clinics where people without names and homes often pass through like whispers. In one shelter on the outskirts of the city, he found a thread to grasp. Sophie had been there, staying under the radar, leaving behind little more than a battered scarf, a nearly empty address book, and a folded piece of paper tucked inside it. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable, and the words burned themselves into Lucas's memory. "If you're reading this, please don't give up. Find Mia. Even if I can't be saved, save her." Lucas stood in that cramped office, the letter trembling slightly in his gloved hand, and felt the weight of everything hit him at once. Sophie hadn't simply vanished, she'd been running. From what he still didn't know. But now, somewhere in Boston, she was alive, or at least she had been alive when she wrote those words. And Mia, the niece who now hummed songs in his kitchen and clung to his side in museums, was counting on him to do what Sophie couldn't bring their family back together. He pushed harder, calling every hospital within a 50-mile radius, speaking to administrators, pleading, demanding, and finally one evening hearing the words he'd been waiting for. "We do have an unidentified patient," a calm voice on the line said. Female, early 30s, brown hair, light eyes, brought in after a hit and run about 3 weeks ago. Significant memory loss. Lucas's hand tightened around the phone. It had to be her. "Can I see her?" he asked, his voice quieter than he expected. The administrator hesitated. "You can, but I need to warn you, she may not recognize you at all. These cases, they're unpredictable." Back at Boston, General Sophie was tracing the word Jack into her notebook again when Nurse Kim entered. "You might have a visitor soon," Kim said, setting down a tray of tea. Sophie looked up, brow furrowed. "Visitor? Who would visit me? I don't even know who I am." Kim hesitated before answering. "Someone who thinks he does." That night, as the city outside wrapped itself in winter's chill, Sophie lay awake staring at the ceiling, her fingers curled around the edge of her notebook. She closed her eyes and let the dream come again, but this time she clung to the child's voice, repeating the cry in her mind, "Mommy." It no longer felt like just a fragment. It felt like a lifeline, a rope pulling her out of the void she had been floating in since the accident. Somewhere that child was real. Somewhere she was waiting. Sophie didn't know yet that Lucas Bennett was already on his way, letter and photo in hand, racing not just to find her, but to pull her out of the shadows, before the memories and the life tied to them slipped away forever. The clock on her wall ticked softly each second, stretching long and thin. Sophie reached for her pen, turned to a blank page, and wrote a single word in careful, deliberate letters: Mia. She didn't know why the name came, but when it did, she felt a strange, aching warmth. The pieces were coming together whether her mind was ready or not. And with every tick of the clock, the distance between her, her daughter, and her brother was shrinking, though none of them yet knew just how close they were to colliding. For weeks, Sophie Carter dreamed of a child's voice calling her back from the dark. Now, as the hospital door opens, her body remembers something her mind cannot, and when Lucas Bennett brings a little girl named Mia into that room, 3 fractured lives are about to collide in a moment that will change everything. The moment Lucas Bennett stepped into the hospital room, he felt his chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. Sophie Carter sat by the window, her shoulders thin beneath the pale hospital gown, her brown hair grazing just past her jawline. She turned at the sound of the door, and for a heartbeat, her gray-blue eyes met his eyes that mirrored his own, and he felt time compress 5 years of distance, reduced to a single pulse of recognition. But then her brow furrowed confusion, dimming the flicker of familiarity. Her voice trembled as she asked, Do I know you? Why does seeing you hurt but feel safe?" Lucas, who had prepared himself for this, forced his voice to remain steady. He took a cautious step closer, pulling a worn photo from the inner pocket of his coat, the same one Mia had clutched on that freezing night. "My name is Lucas," he said softly. "I think I'm your brother." He held the photo out to her. Sophie took it with trembling fingers, her gaze falling on the smiling faces captured in that last Christmas before their lives shattered. Her fingertips traced over her own face, then Lucas's, and finally the faint image of their parents in the background. She whispered almost to herself, "That's me. And you, I don't remember everything, but this feels real." There were no tears yet, just a stunned silence as the weight of that truth settled between them. Lucas wanted to reach for her to pull her into a hug, like they were kids again, but he knew not to rush this fragile moment. "There's someone else you need to see," he said after a pause, his tone careful. "Not today, not unless you're ready, but she's been waiting for you too." The next morning, Sophie sat upright in her chair by the window, her palms slick with nervous sweat despite the chill outside. Lucas stood in the doorway, Mia's small hand resting trustingly in his. The little girl's mismatched mittens clutched Mr. Button, her stuffed rabbit, as she bit her lip, a nervous habit she didn't even realize she shared with her mother. Lucas knelt down beside Mia in the hallway, whispering gently, "Remember, Mommy isn't feeling well. She might not remember everything right away. So we'll help her, okay?" Mia nodded solemnly, eyes wide. When they entered, Sophie turned at the sound of the door. Her eyes fell on the little girl standing beside Lucas, and something deep, primal, and unshakable surged through her. Her breath caught her hands trembling as she whispered a name she hadn't spoken aloud since before the accident, Mia. The word came out like a prayer, a plea and a revelation all at once. Mia froze for only a second before letting go of Lucas's hand and running forward. "Mommy." Sophie dropped to her knees, her arms opening instinctively, and the two collided in an embrace that seemed to fuse broken pieces back together. Sophie buried her face in Mia's hair, her body shaking as tears finally broke free. It wasn't the kind of reunion built on words or clarity. Sophie's mind still didn't hold all the memories, but her heart, her body, every fiber of her being, knew this child was hers. Mia clung to her mother's neck, small sobs muffled against her shoulder, as if releasing weeks of fear and longing in a single breath. Lucas stood by the door, his vision blurring. For all his wealth, for all the power he had accumulated, he realized there was nothing in his life that had ever felt as heavy or as sacred as watching the two people he loved most collapse into each other like they were finding oxygen after being underwater too long. He didn't move closer. This was their moment, and his role was simply to witness, to guard it. The days that followed became a slow process of stitching their lives together again, one thread at a time. Lucas arranged for Sophie to have art therapy sessions as a part of her rehabilitation. In the beginning, her drawings were abstract streaks of color, scattered shapes, but as Mia began to sit beside her with crayons of her own, something shifted. Mia would draw rainbows and simple stick figures holding hands, narrating every detail. "That's me, that's Mommy, that's Uncle Lou." Sophie found herself sketching along her lines, growing more confident. One afternoon, without realizing it, she drew a treehouse nestled in a thick oak, a treehouse Lucas had built when they were children. The moment she saw it, something clicked. She didn't remember every detail, but the memory of Lucas falling from it, his arm in a cast for weeks, bubbled to the surface, and for the first time she laughed. It was a soft, shaky sound, but real. Lucas began joining them in the hospital garden during the afternoons where Sophie's physical therapy exercises blended with slow walks under the winter sun. Mia, bundled in her lavender coat, would feed crumbs to the ducks in the pond, chattering about how one day they would all live together in a place where the ducks could visit too. Sophie would listen, sometimes silent, sometimes smiling, her hand brushing Lucas's as they sat on the bench. She still had gaps, stretches of time she couldn't reach no matter how hard she tried, but when Lucas leaned close and said, "You don't have to remember everything today. What matters is you're here," she believed him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and painted the hospital garden in shades of gold and violet, Sophie turned to Lucas. "Even if the rest never comes back," she said quietly, her eyes fixed on Mia, chasing a butterfly a few feet away. This feels like home. Not because I remember it, but because I feel it. You, her, us. It feels like home." Lucas placed his hand over hers, his voice low but certain. "Then we'll build a new one, piece by piece. No running, no shadows, just us." The three of them lingered there as twilight deepened, a fragile but undeniable family bound by something deeper than memory, bound by the choice to start over, no matter how broken the past had been. And though Sophie's mind still held dark corners, the warmth of Mia's laughter and the steady presence of her brother began to light them one moment at a time. The shadows were behind them now, but a new chapter was waiting. In a quiet Brooklyn brownstone, Lucas Bennett, Sophie Carter and little Mia weren't just surviving anymore, they were learning how to live, to laugh, and to build something neither of them had dared to imagine, a real home. The brownstone stood on a tree-lined street in Brooklyn Heights, its brick exterior warmed by late spring sunlight. Inside, laughter and the faint scent of fresh pancakes replaced the sterile silence that had once defined Lucas Bennett's life. 3 months had passed since Sophie left the hospital, and now every corner of their new home breathed life. The kitchen counters bore smudges of flour from Sunday mornings where Sophie and Mia flipped pancakes with more enthusiasm than skill, while Lucas brewed coffee and pretended not to notice the batter splattering on his shirt. The once pristine living room now held boxes of toys, scattered picture books, and the sound of Mia's delighted giggles as she built forts from couch cushions. For Lucas, who had built an empire in glass towers and boardrooms, this house was the first place that felt like more than an address. It felt alive. The backyard, modest but lush, became their sanctuary. On warm evenings, Lucas strung fairy lights along the wooden fence, while Sophie painted with Mia at a picnic table, their laughter mingling with the hum of the city beyond. On one afternoon, Mia finally learned to ride her pink bicycle without training wheels, Lucas jogging beside her until his steady hand slipped away and she pedaled forward on her own. She stopped at the end of the path, beaming as Sophie cheered, and Lucas scooped her up into the air. See, he told her, the best things feel impossible until you do them. Sophie, now working part-time as an art instructor at a local community center, found her purpose returning in gentle waves. She discovered a quiet joy in guiding children through sketches and colors, channeling the fragments of herself she had feared were gone forever. In the evenings, she'd sit on the porch with Lucas watching Mia chase fireflies across the yard and whisper, "I can't believe this is real." Lucas, who had once measured success only in contracts and profits, would look at his sister and niece and think, "This is the only thing that's ever been real." On a soft golden afternoon, the three of them sat in the living room, sunlight pouring through the windows as Mia pointed to two framed photos on the wall. One was the old photograph the last Christmas Lucas and Sophie had shared before their worlds unraveled. The other was new, the three of them at Prospect Park. Sunlight catching in their smiles, Sophie's arm around Mia Lucas, kneeling beside them. Mia studied the two frames for a long moment before saying softly, "The first one is us when we were lost. The second one is us when we were found." Lucas and Sophie exchanged a look, their eyes shining as they pulled Mia into a gentle embrace. They weren't perfect. There were scars that time couldn't erase and challenges still to face, but here in the home they had built together with Mia's small arms wrapped around both of them, they knew something deeper than perfection. They knew peace and the rare, quiet joy of a second chance. In the bitter cold of a New York winter, Lucas Bennett never expected his life to change because of a pile of cardboard boxes outside a shuttered shop in Times Square. But when he discovered a tiny 4-year-old girl huddled inside, clutching a worn rabbit and a photograph of a sister he thought was lost forever, the walls around his carefully controlled life began to crack. That child, Mia Carter, wasn't just a stranger on the street. She was family. The niece he never knew he had. And in saving her from the freezing darkness, Lucas found himself pulled into a journey far greater than wealth business or his own solitude could ever offer. What began as a single act of compassion became the thread that stitched together lives torn apart by time, fear, and tragedy. Lucas, a man who had built a billion-dollar empire but lived in silent emptiness, had to learn what it meant to care for someone not with money, but with time, patience, and heart. From midnight nightmares to pancakes on Sunday mornings, from quiet museum visits to improvised music on a tiny keyboard, he and Mia built a bond that felt as natural as it was unexpected. But beneath that growing sense of home, there was still an unanswered question. Where was Sophie Carter, the sister Lucas had lost, and Mia's only surviving parent? The answer lay not in New York, but in a quiet hospital room in Boston, where Sophie, stripped of her memory after a hit and run, clung to fragments of dreams. A child's voice calling mommy, a man's face. She couldn't name a fear that had chased her for years. Piece by piece, as Lucas followed her trail through shelters and letters left behind, those fragments began to align. And when Lucas finally stood in front of her photograph in hand and introduced himself as her brother, Sophie didn't yet have all her memories, but she felt the truth in her bones. The true reunion came not with words, but with touch. The moment Sophie saw Mia, her little girl with the brown eyes and mismatched mittens, every barrier shattered. Her mind might have faltered, but her heart knew its child. In a flood of tears and trembling arms, mother and daughter were whole again, with Lucas standing watch like the quiet anchor they both needed. From hospital gardens and art therapy to laughter and shared meals, the three began building a new life, one small step at a time. Months later, their Brooklyn Heights brownstone became the proof of what love and perseverance could build. The man who once counted success in stock prices now counted Mia's milestones, from her first bike ride to the way she ran laughing through their backyard. Sophie, once defined by fear and loss, rediscovered her strength as a mother and an artist guiding children at a community center. and finding peace in the simplest routines. And Mia, who had learned too young how to survive, finally learned what it meant to simply live, to laugh, to sleep, without fear, to feel the roots of belonging. This story reminds us that family is not just blood, but the choice to stand together when the world threatens to scatter us. It teaches us that no matter how broken our past, there is always space for repair, always a chance for second beginnings. In our own lives, this means daring to reach out when we see someone in need, to forgive when pride whispers otherwise, and to create homes not just with walls but with love and presence for those who matter most. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every like, share, and subscription fuels us to bring you more powerful, life-affirming stories like this, stories of hope, healing, and the strength it takes to find our way back home. Stay with us, and let's keep these stories alive together.